What I'm getting at is that there is a lot of effort right now in the non-chemical community to try to scale and escalate the basic non-herbicide, no-till, smother crop, idea within the cropping system.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Labels. I'm your co-host, Dr. Sina McCullough, and I'm here with Joel Salatin, everyone's favorite farmer. Hi, Joel.
Hi, Sina.
Well, today we have another listener's question for Joel. We recently recorded a podcast about how to start a garden, and we got a great question sent in from Sarah Skipper. And I'm going to read it to you now, and I'm going to give the mic over to Joel. Okay, Sarah asks, she says, "Good morning. Listening to y'all's podcast this morning and thought I would send a question like you asked. I'm confused on how to practically do no-till because of all the grass growth between winter and early spring. I still need my shovel to help out. So at that point, what's the point of not tilling so I can more easily plant? Especially when I'm talking about a larger garden. Thank you for your time in y'all's podcast."
Okay, so this is like so many questions. This has a lot of nuances that are kind of hard to get to sometimes. So, like a lot of things, the no-till interest right now in things, it can easily be a pendulum that swings too far the wrong way. So what is really the culprit here in tilling is inversion of soil layers. I think if we start there, that's the important thing. It's the inversion of soil layers. So you've got your top few inches, anywhere from down to 4, 5, maybe 6 inches is aerobic, and then under 6 inches is anaerobic, and you have all sorts of different. So that's like salt water and fresh water that you don't want to mix, and so the enemy of soil is where you moldboard plow, where you invert those soil layers. So this notion that I can never stir, there's a difference between stirring and inverting. Okay, when you stir and you maintain the levels, you're okay. So there's certainly nothing wrong with with stirring that top bit. Now, so that's the big picture. So Sina, how have you developed your beds? Have you done any disturbance, or did you just start with a bunch of mulch?
Yeah, I don't disturb the soil at all. Mm-hmm. So, I did like what you and I talked about in the last podcast about gardening, starting to garden. Right. I just start with the ground how it is, and I build layers onto it. And right now, the top of it is mulch. Mm-hmm. I would like to get into cover cropping, in between the seasons. Sure. But I really just do the layered approach. I don't disturb the soil at all. But I would also say, though, my caveat is I really try to conserve and build a robust microbiome in the soil. Right. So the way that I garden is largely based on what I found in the scientific literature. And I brought one study, of course, right, Joel, this wouldn't be one of our podcasts unless I cited at least one study. Yeah. And I'll put this in the study notes. So this is just one study that I found on PubMed. There's many more like this. In this study, scientists tracked the soil microbial community in comparing cover crop with no-till and tilling. And the bottom line is what they found was that the total number of microbes, that diversity and number was higher when you did no-till versus standard till, and that the diversity increased with the depth in the no-till, right? the death in the soil, the no-till, but the diversity decreased depending on the depth of standard tilling. So they're showing that you are disturbing the microbiome, that you're going to have less diversity and less total number of microbes when you are doing the standard till. They also showed that tillage, if you tilled and then you didn't use a cover crop, you also shifted the microbial communities toward the faster growing competitors. So in other words, you created a dysbiosis in the soil. So that's my one little, scientific tidbit as to why I don't touch the soil at all. I leave it there and I try to put layers on, which is what I think it's more of a way that nature would be building the soil and growing in the soil.
Right. So this question. So yeah, you can go from a sod from your lawn, you can go directly to garden. One of the most common ways is to put down cardboard and then put your mulch on top of it. I've done that. Sometimes it's called lasagna gardening, where but it does take time. You have to be a year in advance and get it killed. Now, J.M. Fortier, who's a kind of guru in Quebec on gardening, he uses tarps. So he buys tarps and and cuts the tarps in exactly the same size as his bed, and he does gardening on a 1.5 acre scale. He makes a 6-figure income on 1.5 acres of intensively done produce. Now I will tell you, and here's the thing to understand: he's probably as big a guru on no-till gardening as anybody I know, but he still has a backup BCS walk-behind tiller that he uses once in a while for different applications. So the part of this question that's so critical is to deal with the grass that comes in between fall and spring. And so the answer to that, so then she says, well, I got to get my shovel, then what's the point? Well, the point is that with the shovel or a broad fork or an instrument like that, you're actually not inverting the soil levels. You're actually just loosening that soil. There's a big, and so your study there, Sina, about conventional tillage. When I suggest some sort of a soil surface disturbance, even with a hand tool, a trowel or whatever, or disturbance with a broad fork, where you're actually not tilling at all, you're simply loosening. The broad fork has been the instrument. I have one, and if you have well-designed built soil, you can cover a lot of ground with a broad fork pretty quick. There's some pretty big commercial gardeners that use nothing more than a broad fork. Elliot Coleman is a fan of the broad fork, and he has designed numerous what he calls surface tillage things, where he actually duct tapes a cordless drill onto a thing, and he can go through and just disturb about 2 inches deep. See, that doesn't mix the salt water and seawater. That's just, and what that does is get you a really, really nice seed bed. And Elliot Coleman is, of course, he is absolutely the world guru on gardening. Has made his living doing it for a long time. If you ever go visit him, he's like, he's the ultimate picture perfect. He's invented all sorts of really specific tools to be able to get everything planted perfectly. His garden looks like a CAD drawing engineer, and it's just fantastic. But he does real light surface tillage like this, and so I think the key here is to always be thinking a season in advance. The problem with gardening is we tend to we work at it during the season, and then in the fall it's out of sight, out of mind. And anyone who does, who really is a gardening guru, will tell you that the next spring's garden is really created by how you put the garden to bed in the fall. Now, whether that's a cover crop that would obviously, the cover crop would obviously smother out grass encroachment, or whether it's a fresh layer, whatever, 10 inches of rotted wood chips or leaves. If when you rake your yard leaves, you can put all those leaves on there. What you don't want to do is walk away from it in the fall with it kind of unmulched, unprotected, and just, and bare soil. That's where you get your weed, grass, and all that sort of thing, encroachment. J.M. Fortier even, he'll actually put one of his tarps on it. He's got a whole roll of these tarps. He makes the tarps the exact size of his bed, the size of his beds. And it doesn't take but a minute to roll them out. And if you go out in the yard and you pick up like an old piece of board or something that was left in the yard for a long time, you pick up that board, you ever noticed how underneath there's no sod, but there's all these earthworm castings? I mean, in fact, there's if you want to go fishing, just put a couple planks out in the yard, leave it for 3 months, and that's where you'll get all your fishing worms, right? You'll find these. And so that's essentially the idea that he has with the tarps. So, my answer there is a multiple answer. You can start with cardboard on the ground, an impervious barrier, and just start by laying a bunch of compost and mulch on top. Leave it a year. You can start with a broad fork and just loosen things and just shake out the dirt from the sod, put the sod in your compost pile, and go with it. The critical thing is to not invert the soil layers. And Sina, you even mentioned in your study, deep, I noted it down, that the deeper you went, the worse the microdiversity was, the deeper tillage. So I'm talking about a very light surface disturbance, like to get a nice seed bed, if you're going to plant, and also a minimal disturbance, even with say something like a broad fork or a spade, where you're not inverting, you're simply loosening, creating some channels there where you can shake out some of the winter weeds and the grass and things like that. That can be done. The main thing is the deep tillage and the inversion, the mixing of those soil layers. That's what you're trying to avoid. So, as we think about no-till, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's realize that that a hoe and gentle disturbance is acceptable in a prep situation. And the main reason that grass encroaches during the winter is because in the fall we're tired, we get our last harvest, we walk away from it, and we don't actually put it to bed with good covers on, whether it's a cover crop or a cover mulch or a cover tarp. We walk away from it in the fall and don't put a good cover on it.
Yeah, nature does not like to be naked, right?
No. When you take that clothing off the soil, something's going to find a place to go in that, because the soil wants to be covered, and so it's going to do everything possible to get covered. So if we can put a little bit of extra effort there in the fall, putting it to bed, then we can minimize that spring that spring desire to get things covered.
Yeah, so I love that. Great explanation. And what I'm wondering is if you can go into a little more detail about why somebody would switch or switch from tilling to no tilling, or why would they start with a no-till approach? Because I think this is a little foreign to a lot of people because we're used to seeing industrial farming, right? I'm sure everybody's, been on a highway or a freeway and they've seen the rows and rows of crops that are grown industrially. They've seen the big plows and whatnot. So for some people, it is a little bit of a foreign concept. It took me a while to get used to the fact that that wasn't traditional farming, so if you could just explain why would somebody want to put forth that extra thought, right? The extra effort, that putting nature to bed, in the winter, what is the benefit here? And if you can also touch on, especially for a larger scale farm, how this could be a benefit given the current skyrocketing prices in diesel.
Yeah. So we're not talking about, so just so everybody understands, there is a huge effort right now and a lot of actual creativity in large scale farming, even with, soybeans and corn and wheat and barley, with no-till systems. Traditionally, no-till meant herbicides. So you spray down the herbicide, you burn it down with an herbicide, and then you can plant into it with a planter that makes a little itty bitty slit, enough of a slit in there to get a seed in, and you go forward. Well, now it's important to realize that even with the herbicide, that has produced monumental soil changes because you don't invert the soil layers, you don't break the capillary action, all those earthworm tunnels in the soil, you don't break up all those tunnels, so the water, rain penetrates a lot better because the tunnels are not severed. And the other thing about tillage is that it hyper aerates the soil. So it's like you've got this microbial activity, and when you actually deep till you actually add so much oxygen that the organic matter burns out. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. You've got this nice steady microbial activity, and then you suddenly inject it artificially with a bunch of super oxygen, and it's like throwing gas on a fire, and so you actually burn out the organic matter. So there are a lot of critical reasons to reduce tillage, not the least of which is that when you have bare soil surface, you have tremendous erosion. That's the main thing. And so with these no-till systems that really started to come in the early 1970s with herbicide, they did show a tremendous number of soil benefits, even with the herbicide. So now the organic community has tried to go a step. Okay, we see all these benefits from no-till. Now, can we do no-till without herbicide? So there's this, there's huge desire in the part of many to go this approach, and so there have been numerous tools called crimpers, where you plant, say, a cover crop of hairy vetch and rye. Rye will grow up, 6 feet tall. Vetch is a legume that is like a bean, a pea that trellises up the rye, and it makes this extremely dense, what's called a smother crop. So you have a cover crop, a cover crop / smother crop, and so instead of killing it with herbicide, you let it grow up and get pretty tall, and then you run a crimper over it, which is like a it's like a big pavement roller. Imagine a yard roller, but with cleats on it, and it actually rolls down this. Imagine this real heavy vegetation. It rolls it down and crimps it. It doesn't till it just crimps it, so it gets all pushed onto the soil surface, and it might make a mulch 6 inches deep, and then they slit and they plant corn, soybeans, barley, wheat. They plant into that mulch, and now suddenly you have this wonderful smother mulch on the soil surface. In fact, I was just reading several articles. I just was in Texas speaking at a conference, and I was just reading articles about some of the the chief proponents, or the chief innovators in this space, and one of their problems is they were talking about how to get a perfect planting, because the problem is if you have a spot, let's say it's whatever 10 feet 20 feet that where you don't get good germination on this, that's where then when you go in and you plant your actual crop, now you've got all these weeds in there because you don't have the smother crop. So what I'm getting at is that there is a lot of effort right now being expended in the non-chemical community to try to scale and escalate the basic non-herbicide, no-till, smother crop, idea within the cropping system. But the reason that you don't want to do the conventional plow disc, deep tillage where you're going down deep, is to not over aerate the soil, to try to keep a cover on top of it so it doesn't erode when the rain hits it, to not break the capillary action, and to not invert the soil layers. There's a lot of reason to do all that. Fortunately, on a backyard gardening scale, we have some options that the large crop farmer doesn't have. Just our ability to use a broad fork, to use a tarp, to spread, to very meticulously spread numerous kinds of mulch on top. We have capacity to do that, and it's quite amazing. I was just on a farm this weekend in Texas, down by Houston, very, very hot, very, very dry, where they have brought in mountains of wood chips, and that soil, that it is hard. It's just like concrete, but over 10 years, by putting all these wood chips on, I could take my hand and just go down 12 inches deep in just black loamy. It was just wonderful, growing beautiful vegetable crops in Austin, Texas, which is hot and dry. So this really, the main thing is not inverting and keeping that armor, keeping a cover on the soil surface.
Yeah, I love that. And we're about out of time, but I just wondered if you could quickly touch on the fact that, with inflation here and, shortages in inputs for gardening, fertilizers and whatnot, there's really an opportunity here to start a no-till garden or to transition to one, right? There's an economic incentive here, as these costs of the inputs are increasing. So as you can decrease inputs, right, in your gardening effort, whether you're small scale or large scale, it is going to benefit you economically. Like one of the benefits, right, is less water input, which is going to help in areas like California, right, where there's more droughts. Right. But another one of the benefits is going to be that you don't have to have the input of fertilizer, right, when you're doing these cover crops in this no-till. Can you just speak on that quickly?
Yeah, well, okay. So the way the soil builds, in nature, nobody comes on with a bag of chemical 10 in nature and applies that, and yet
that's the soil fairies, right?
Yeah,
the soil fairies come along, sprinkle it.
That's right. And yet again, I go back to 500 years ago. North America produced more nutrition, more food than it does today. And so when we look at how does nature historically build soil, it builds soil with biomass. So the sun grows biomass then either goes through an animal for decomposition or decomposes in situ, on site, falls over and decomposes. And that decaying organic matter is what feeds the biology in the soil, which is for example, the azotobacter, or freestanding bacteria in the soil, that if you have 4% organic matter, they wake up and they reach out and bring in 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is a huge amount. So this is not a legume. This is not a rhizome. This is not a nodule on the bottom of a pea or a green bean or soybean or something. This is actually freestanding bacteria, but the soil has to be 4% organic matter. Most crop fields in the U.S. are not now 4% organic matter. They're more like 1% or 2%. They're like concrete. And basically the chemical fertilizer goes on like an IV, in concrete. And so there's no soil life, there's no soil biology. So the whole goal here of feeding the soil a mulch, a constant mulch on top, whether that mulch is from a cover crop that we take down, or whether it's wood chips or leaves or straw or hay that we're putting on it. It's the decaying organic matter that actually feeds the biology in the soil, so the biology, all the microbes, can do what they're supposed to do. And that's the basic goal.
I love that. Wow. So I thought this would be a real quick episode and it would just wrap up nicely, but it's so much more complex, than one would think. And every time you speak, I'm like, oh, I want to talk about that. Oh, let's talk about that. So I've already been mentally noting some ideas for the upcoming podcast. So, okay, we're out of time though for this one. So Joel, I want to thank you immensely for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And I want to thank Sarah Skipper for sending in the question. If anybody else has other questions that they would love for Joel or I to answer, please email me your question, handsoffmyfood@1791.com. All right, we'll see you next week.